"You'll never own anything as long as you live," my father said without even looking up from the stack of papers spread across the kitchen table. His voice was calm, almost casual, as though he were commenting on the weather instead of deciding what kind of future I deserved. My mother didn't argue with him. She simply nodded once before taking another sip of coffee. I was 21 years old, standing in the house where I had grown up, holding the acceptance letter to a construction management program I had worked 2 jobs to afford. I folded the letter back into its envelope, smiled politely, and walked out the front door. 15 years later, those same 2 people stood frozen inside a law office, staring at a property deed with my name printed across the top in bold black letters. Neither of them said a word. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the air conditioner. If someone had told me that silence could be louder than shouting, I never would have believed them until that day. But to understand why that single sheet of paper mattered so much, you have to understand where everything began. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, where nearly every house had a white picket fence, a basketball hoop over the garage, and a flag hanging from the porch. From the outside, my family looked like every other hard-working American family on the block. My father, Richard Carter, owned a small auto repair shop. My mother, Linda, worked part-time at a local insurance office. We never had luxury vacations or expensive cars, but we always had food on the table and the lights stayed on. People thought we were happy. They thought we were close. They were only seeing what my parents wanted the world to see. Inside our home, there was an invisible scale that measured everyone differently. My younger sister, Olivia, could do no wrong. Every report card earned applause. Every mistake became someone else's fault. Every dream she mentioned immediately became a family project. If she wanted piano lessons, my parents found the money. If she wanted a newer car, they called it an investment in her future. When I talked about my own plans, the conversation usually ended before it had a chance to begin. My father had a favorite phrase: "Some people are born to lead, and some are born to follow." Somehow, I was always placed in the second group. It didn't matter that I fixed broken bicycles for kids in the neighborhood or spent weekends helping contractors just to learn how houses were built. Those things were dismissed as hobbies. According to my parents, I lacked ambition, even while I was working harder than anyone they knew. Looking back now, I realized they had already decided who I was long before I had the chance to prove them wrong. Their opinions became walls around every possibility. Still, I never hated them. Children have a remarkable ability to believe that love simply looks different in every family. I convinced myself they were trying to make me stronger. I told myself that maybe one day they would be proud. Every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, I searched their faces for the smallest sign that they finally saw me differently. It never came. Instead, there were more comparisons. More reminders that Olivia was buying a new condo while I was renting a tiny apartment. More jokes about how I would probably always be someone else's employee. They laughed. I laughed too, because pretending not to care hurt less than admitting the truth. The apartment I rented after leaving home measured barely 600 square feet. The kitchen was so small that opening the refrigerator blocked the oven door. The heating system rattled every winter night, and whenever it rained hard, I placed a bucket beneath the bedroom window because water always found its way inside. Most people would have seen it as a place to escape from. I saw it as proof that every dream starts somewhere. During the day, I worked construction. At night, I studied building plans, financing, zoning regulations, and everything else I could teach myself from library books and secondhand textbooks. I learned how neighborhoods changed over time. I learned why one property gained value while another didn't. I learned that the people who quietly built wealth rarely looked wealthy at all. They simply made patient decisions over and over again. Years passed that way. I stopped expecting birthday calls from my parents. I stopped trying to explain my plans because every conversation ended with another prediction about why I would fail. Instead, I focused on becoming the kind of man whose work spoke louder than his words. There was something peaceful about being underestimated. No one watched you closely. No one believed you were capable of surprising them. That kind of invisibility can become an unexpected advantage if you know how to use it. Then one rainy Tuesday afternoon, just as I was finishing a routine inspection on a small remodeling project, my phone buzzed with a call from a number I almost ignored. It was a local attorney asking if I could come by his office later that week regarding a property transfer that required my signature. I thanked him, hung up, and stood there for several seconds watching raindrops slide across the windshield of my old pickup truck. I had no idea that one appointment would reopen every door I thought I had permanently closed, or that the people who once promised I would never own anything would soon find themselves staring at the one document they never imagined could exist with my name written across the top. The attorney had only given me a date and a time. He had not explained why he wanted to see me, and I did not waste energy trying to guess. Years of working construction had taught me that most problems were solved one step at a time. You measured carefully, poured a solid foundation, and trusted the process instead of rushing toward the finished building. That simple philosophy had quietly become the way I lived my life. Every morning I woke before sunrise, packed my own lunch, climbed into my pickup truck, and drove wherever the next project happened to be. Some weeks I framed new homes. Other weeks, I supervised renovations inside old brick buildings that had stood for nearly a century. The work was honest, demanding, and predictable. At the end of every week, I knew exactly what I had earned because I had earned every dollar myself. My apartment remained modest even after my income improved. Friends occasionally asked why I did not move into a larger place or buy a newer truck. I always smiled and changed the subject. They saw someone living below his means. I saw someone buying freedom one careful decision at a time. Every bonus check went into savings. Every overtime shift became another brick in the future I was quietly building. While other people chased appearances, I chased stability. It was not exciting, and it certainly did not impress anyone, but it helped me sleep well every night. My parents, however, interpreted my quiet lifestyle very differently. Whenever our paths crossed during holidays or family gatherings, they assumed nothing had changed. My father would ask the same questions every year. Was I still renting? Was I still driving that old truck? Had I finally found a better job? Before I could finish answering, he usually reached his own conclusion. He would shake his head with a disappointed smile and remind everyone at the table that ambition was the difference between surviving and succeeding. My mother rarely challenged him. She simply changed the subject by asking Olivia about her newest plans. My sister had become a real estate agent, and every conversation somehow circled back to her latest listing or another client who had bought an expensive home. My parents listened with admiration that filled the room. I listened quietly while cutting another piece of turkey or passing another bowl of mashed potatoes across the table. There was a time when those moments left a heavy feeling in my chest. Eventually, they became strangely peaceful because I stopped expecting approval that was never going to come. Instead of defending myself, I observed. I noticed how easily people confused confidence with success. I noticed how quickly they judged someone by the neighborhood where he lived or the vehicle parked in his driveway. The truth was much simpler. Every month my savings account grew. Every year I understood the housing market a little better. Every mistake became another lesson that no classroom could have taught me. One afternoon, after finishing work on a duplex renovation, I met an older investor named Harold Bennett. He had spent more than 40 years buying neglected properties, restoring them, and renting them to working families. Harold did not wear expensive suits or drive luxury cars. He carried a faded notebook filled with handwritten numbers and spent more time asking questions than giving speeches. We started talking while inspecting the foundation of a small house outside town. Instead of treating me like another contractor, he asked what I thought the property would be worth after repairs. I gave him my estimate, expecting him to disagree. Instead, he smiled and asked how I reached that number. We stood there for nearly an hour discussing neighborhoods, school districts, interest rates, and long-term value. Before leaving, he handed me a business card and said something I have never forgotten. He said that the market always rewarded patience more than excitement. That sentence stayed with me for weeks. Harold became an unexpected mentor, not because he gave me money or special opportunities, but because he answered questions that nobody else had time to answer. Sometimes we met for coffee before work. Sometimes we walked through old properties together while he explained why one cracked foundation was worth repairing and another should be avoided completely. He taught me to read financial statements with the same attention I once gave construction blueprints. He reminded me that owning property was never about showing off. It was about creating options that could not disappear overnight. Little by little, I began preparing for something larger than the next paycheck. I still kept my routine exactly the same. I still packed my lunch. I still drove the same pickup truck with more than 200,000 miles on the odometer. Even my coworkers assumed I was simply content with a simple life. None of them knew that every quiet decision was leading somewhere important. The funny thing about real progress is that it often looks invisible until the day it suddenly becomes impossible to ignore. As the appointment with the attorney drew closer, I found myself thinking less about the paperwork and more about the road that had brought me there. I remembered every early morning, every skipped vacation, every weekend, spent learning instead of spending. None of those sacrifices had felt dramatic at the time. They were just small choices repeated again and again until they became habits. I did not realize then that those habits were about to place me in a room with the very people who had underestimated me for most of my life, and that a single document waiting inside a leather folder would quietly reveal a truth that years of arguments never could. The meeting with Harold became part of my weekly routine, but he never treated me like a student sitting through a lecture. He believed the best lessons happened while walking through unfinished houses, standing inside empty living rooms, or looking at neighborhoods that most people ignored. He would ask me what I noticed first. Sometimes I mentioned the roof. Other times I pointed out the plumbing or the condition of the foundation. Harold always smiled before asking a second question that mattered far more. He wanted to know whether I could imagine what the property would become instead of focusing only on what it was today. That way of thinking slowly changed every part of my life. I stopped seeing obstacles as permanent. I started looking at every setback as something that could be repaired with enough patience and careful planning. My evenings became filled with research instead of television. I studied property records, local zoning updates, mortgage rates, and neighborhood development plans. The public library became as familiar to me as any job site. Librarians greeted me by name because they knew I would leave carrying another stack of books about finance, construction, or small business management. None of it felt glamorous. Most nights I heated leftover soup, sat at the tiny kitchen table in my apartment, and filled notebook after notebook with calculations. There were evenings when exhaustion tempted me to quit early, but I always remembered something my father had unknowingly taught me. If people expected very little from you, they usually stopped paying attention. That became my greatest advantage. While everyone assumed I was standing still, I was quietly moving forward one decision at a time. About 2 years after meeting Harold, he invited me to look at a small duplex that had been sitting vacant for months. The building needed new flooring, updated electrical work, fresh paint, and countless smaller repairs that scared away inexperienced buyers. Most investors walked through the front door, shook their heads, and left within 10 minutes. Harold did not say much while we inspected every room. When we finished, he asked a simple question. He wanted to know whether I believed the numbers worked. I had already spent hours reviewing comparable sales and estimated renovation costs before arriving. For the first time, I answered with confidence instead of hesitation. I believed the property could become profitable if the work was done carefully and the financing remained disciplined. Harold nodded as though he had been waiting to hear exactly that answer. Then he surprised me. Instead of making an offer himself, he encouraged me to consider buying it. My first reaction was laughter because I assumed he was joking. I had savings, but I had never imagined owning an entire property. Harold reminded me that opportunities rarely arrived after people felt completely ready. They usually appeared while uncertainty still existed. He offered to guide me through the process, but he made one thing very clear. Every decision would remain mine. Every signature would belong to me. Every success or mistake would become my responsibility. I spent several sleepless nights reviewing every number again and again. I imagined everything that could go wrong. Unexpected repairs, rising interest rates, empty rental units. I also imagined what might happen if I continued waiting forever. Eventually, I realized that fear could become just another excuse for standing still. The morning I submitted my offer, my hands trembled slightly as I signed the paperwork. It was not because I doubted the property. It was because I understood I was crossing a line between dreaming about a different future and actually building one. The offer was accepted 3 days later. I drove to the duplex alone after work and parked across the street. The grass had grown too high. Several windows were covered with dusty blinds, and the front porch leaned slightly to one side. To anyone else, it looked forgotten. To me, it looked like possibility. Renovating the building required nearly every spare hour I had. I painted walls after finishing full shifts at construction sites. I replaced damaged trim on weekends. Friends occasionally asked why I looked so tired, and I simply smiled before saying I had been busy. I never mentioned the duplex because I had learned that unfinished goals were easier to protect when they remained private. Even my parents knew nothing about it. During another Thanksgiving dinner, my father once again asked whether I was still renting the same apartment. Before I could answer, Olivia laughed gently and suggested that I should think about buying a place before prices climbed even higher. My mother agreed, saying that owning a home required long-term planning and financial discipline. I almost smiled at the irony. Sitting there with a plate of turkey in front of me, I listened quietly while the three of them discussed the importance of building equity. None of them realized that I had spent the previous evening installing kitchen cabinets inside a property that would soon belong entirely to me. For a brief moment, I considered telling them the truth. I imagined the surprise on their faces and wondered whether they would finally see me differently. Then I looked around the table and understood that I no longer needed their approval to measure my progress. Some victories became more meaningful when they remained silent until the right moment. So I thanked my mother for passing the cranberry sauce, complimented the pumpkin pie, and let the conversation move on without correcting anyone. As I drove home later that night beneath the cold November sky, I felt lighter than I had in years because I finally understood that confidence did not come from proving people wrong. It came from no longer needing them to believe you before believing in yourself. Spring arrived just as the renovation on the duplex was finally coming together. Fresh paint brightened the walls that had once looked forgotten. New flooring stretched across every room, and sunlight poured through. Windows that no longer felt neglected. The transformation reminded me of something Harold had said months earlier. He believed that the greatest value was often hidden beneath years of neglect because most people stopped looking too soon. Standing in the living room after installing the final light fixture, I finally understood exactly what he meant. The building had changed, but so had I. I was no longer simply earning a paycheck from one construction project to the next. I was creating something that would continue working long after I finished swinging a hammer. The first tenants moved in only a few weeks later. They were a young married couple expecting their first child. They thanked me repeatedly for making the apartment feel warm and welcoming, and I could not help smiling as they carried boxes through the front door. Watching someone begin a new chapter of life inside a property I owned felt different from any paycheck I had ever received. It was not about collecting rent. It was about realizing that years of discipline had finally become something real that I could see with my own eyes. The monthly income was not enormous, but it covered the mortgage, maintenance, and still left enough to place into a separate savings account dedicated entirely to future investments. Harold congratulated me, but reminded me not to become distracted by early success. He said that many people made one good decision and immediately assumed they had mastered everything. Real success, according to him, came from repeating good decisions consistently over many years. I took his advice seriously. Instead of celebrating with expensive purchases, I continued living exactly as before. My pickup truck still carried scratches from countless job sites. My apartment remained small. I still packed homemade lunches and compared grocery prices every weekend. If anyone had looked at my daily routine, they would have assumed nothing had changed. That was perfectly fine with me because appearances had never paid a mortgage or built long-term security. Nearly 18 months passed before another opportunity appeared. A retired couple wanted to sell a small single-family home that needed cosmetic repairs but had been maintained with exceptional care. The location was improving because a new elementary school and several local businesses were opening nearby. Most buyers focused on how outdated the kitchen looked. I focused on the quiet streets, solid foundation, and growing community surrounding the property. After weeks of careful planning and conversations with my lender, I purchased my second property. This renovation moved much faster because experience had replaced uncertainty. I already knew reliable electricians, plumbers, and suppliers. More importantly, I knew when to spend money and when patience produced a better result. Every completed project strengthened not only my finances, but also my confidence. The fear that once accompanied every major decision slowly faded, replaced by steady preparation and realistic expectations. My relationship with Harold also evolved. He no longer answered every question directly. Instead, he challenged me to defend my own conclusions. Sometimes he deliberately disagreed with me just to test whether I truly understood the numbers behind a decision. At first, I found those conversations frustrating, but eventually I realized he was preparing me for a future when I would have nobody else to rely on. He wanted me to trust my own judgment rather than borrow his confidence forever. Looking back, that may have been the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. Meanwhile, my family continued believing the same story they had created years earlier. During birthdays and holiday dinners, my father still asked predictable questions with the same confident tone. He assumed my quiet personality reflected limited ambition rather than deliberate restraint. My mother often worried aloud that I worked too hard without having much to show for it. Olivia spoke enthusiastically about clients purchasing larger homes and investment properties, never realizing that I quietly listened because many of those conversations confirmed trends I had already been studying. I never corrected any of them. Keeping my plans private was no longer about proving anyone wrong. It was about protecting the peace I had worked so hard to build. The less outside opinion influenced my decisions, the clearer those decisions became. One Saturday afternoon, while organizing paperwork inside my apartment, I spread property tax statements, insurance documents, mortgage records, and maintenance receipts across the kitchen table. The stack of folders had grown much larger than I realized. I paused for a moment and thought back to another kitchen table many years earlier, the one where my father had dismissed every dream I had shared. At the time, I believed his words described my future. Now I understood they had only described the limits of his imagination. There was a remarkable difference between those two things. My phone rang before I could finish organizing the files. Harold wanted to meet for coffee the following morning. His voice sounded thoughtful, almost unusually serious. He explained that he wanted to discuss an opportunity that might accelerate everything I had been building. He refused to explain further over the phone, insisting that some conversations deserved to happen face to face. After we ended the call, I placed the folders neatly back into their box and looked around my apartment. It was still the same modest place with the same worn furniture and familiar view from the window, yet everything inside my life had quietly changed. I simply had not felt the need to announce it to the world. What I did not realize was that Harold's next proposal would eventually lead to the appointment with attorney Daniel Brooks, where a single property deed would reveal far more than ownership. It would expose years of quiet determination that nobody in my family had ever bothered to notice. I met Harold at the same small coffee shop where we had shared dozens of conversations over the years. The waitress already knew both of our orders before we sat down. That familiarity made the morning feel ordinary, but something about Harold's expression told me this meeting would be different. After a few minutes of casual conversation, he reached into his leather briefcase and placed a thin folder on the table. He slid it toward me without saying a word. Inside were photographs of a 3-unit brick building on the east side of Columbus, along with financial statements, inspection reports, and neighborhood development plans. I spent several minutes studying every page while Harold waited patiently. When I finally looked up, he smiled and asked what I thought. My first instinct was to point out the challenges. The roof would eventually need replacement. 2 of the units required updated kitchens. Parking was limited. Harold nodded after each observation before asking the question that mattered most. He wanted to know whether I also saw the opportunity. I looked back at the documents and noticed details that many buyers would probably ignore. The building sat less than 2 miles from a new medical center that had recently begun expanding. Several nearby streets were already attracting young professionals looking for affordable housing close to work. Local businesses had started renovating older storefronts, and property values had been increasing steadily rather than dramatically, which often suggested healthier long-term growth. The numbers were not flashy, but they were solid. Harold leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. He explained that the owner planned to retire and wanted a straightforward sale instead of a bidding war. Several investors had already walked away because they wanted faster returns with less effort. Then Harold said something that caught me completely off guard. He told me he believed I was ready to purchase the building myself. I laughed quietly, convinced he had overestimated what I could afford. He reminded me that I had been preparing for this moment much longer than I realized. We reviewed my savings, the equity from my first 2 properties, my income, and every financial obligation I carried. Instead of focusing on what I lacked, Harold showed me how years of disciplined choices had quietly created options I never imagined possible. For the first time, I saw my own financial picture through the eyes of someone else. It was not perfect, but it was far stronger than I had allowed myself to believe. Over the following weeks, I met with lenders, reviewed documents, ordered inspections, and asked more questions than I ever had during any previous purchase. Every decision felt heavier because the investment was larger, but experience kept fear from taking control. I no longer believed success came from taking reckless risks. It came from understanding the numbers well enough that uncertainty became manageable instead of overwhelming. After careful negotiation, my offer was accepted. The day I signed the purchase agreement, I did not celebrate with an expensive dinner or a vacation. I drove to one of my rental properties, walked through the empty unit that had just been repainted, and reminded myself that every achievement depended on continuing the habits that created it. Success was not an event. It was a routine. Renovating the new building became my largest project yet. I coordinated contractors before sunrise, managed construction schedules after finishing my regular workday, and spent weekends inspecting progress room by room. There were unexpected expenses, delayed deliveries, and small setbacks that tested my patience, but none of them surprised me. Harold had always said that problems were part of the price of ownership, not evidence that ownership had been a mistake. Those words stayed with me whenever another repair appeared. Months later, all 3 units were occupied by reliable tenants. The monthly income exceeded my original projections, not because I had been lucky, but because I had prepared carefully and refused to rush decisions. Quietly, my financial foundation became stronger than it had ever been. Yet almost nobody around me noticed. My truck still had the same worn seats. I still wore durable work boots instead of expensive shoes. I still spent Friday evenings reviewing budgets rather than searching for ways to impress strangers. During another family gathering, my father joked that I probably knew every landlord in the city after renting for so many years. Olivia laughed politely and suggested that one day I might finally buy a starter home if I kept saving. My mother agreed that owning real estate required years of careful planning and more responsibility than most people understood. I listened without interrupting. Correcting them would have changed nothing. They had already decided what my life looked like, and I no longer felt responsible for changing that picture. The greatest difference between the man sitting quietly at the dinner table and the young man who had once left home carrying an acceptance letter was no longer money. It was peace. I had stopped measuring my worth through someone else's expectations. A few weeks after completing the final paperwork for the 3-unit building, Harold called and asked whether I had updated all of my ownership records with attorney Daniel Brooks. I admitted that I had postponed the appointment because work had been so busy. Harold became unusually firm. He reminded me that building assets also meant protecting them properly. Titles, deeds, insurance, and legal records mattered just as much as renovations and financial planning. He insisted that I schedule the meeting immediately. I took his advice, contacted Daniel Brooks the next morning, and accepted the earliest available appointment. At the time, I believed it would be nothing more than another routine step in managing my growing investments. I had no idea that a simple meeting to organize legal documents would soon place my parents in the same office, standing only a few feet away from a property deed that would quietly dismantle every assumption they had carried about me for nearly 2 decades. The appointment with attorney Daniel Brooks was scheduled for the following Thursday afternoon. I entered it into my calendar, gathered the documents he requested, and returned to my normal routine without giving it much thought. Life had taught me that the most important milestones rarely announce themselves in advance. They usually arrive disguised as ordinary days. The week passed quickly as I balanced construction projects, tenant phone calls, and routine maintenance on my properties. There was comfort in that rhythm because every responsibility reminded me that the life I had built rested on consistent effort rather than sudden luck. 2 days before my meeting with Daniel Brooks, my phone rang while I was reviewing estimates for a roofing contractor. The caller identification surprised me. It was my mother. We usually spoke only during birthdays or major holidays, so seeing her name in the middle of a workday immediately felt unusual. I answered with a friendly greeting, expecting a simple conversation. Instead, she sounded unusually warm. She asked how work had been going, whether I was eating well, and if I had been staying healthy. The questions themselves were ordinary, but the tone felt unfamiliar. After years of brief conversations, she suddenly wanted to know every detail about my life. Before ending the call, she mentioned that she and my father had been talking about how long it had been since the family spent meaningful time together. She suggested meeting for lunch over the weekend. I agreed without hesitation because I had no reason to refuse. Families drift apart sometimes, and perhaps this was simply an honest attempt to reconnect. Still, after hanging up, I found myself thinking about the conversation longer than expected. Something about it felt carefully rehearsed. Saturday arrived with clear skies and mild spring weather. We met at a neighborhood restaurant that had been serving homemade comfort food for decades. My father was already seated when I arrived, smiling more than usual. My mother greeted me with a hug that lasted slightly longer than I remembered. Olivia joined us a few minutes later, carrying stories about her newest clients and recent home sales. At first, everything felt surprisingly relaxed. We talked about sports, local events, and memories from childhood. Nobody criticized my career. Nobody compared me to anyone else. It was almost unsettling how pleasant the conversation seemed. Eventually, my father leaned back in his chair and asked whether I had considered changing jobs. Before I could answer, he quickly corrected himself and asked whether I had found opportunities to move ahead financially. The question sounded innocent, but I recognized the familiar curiosity beneath it. I smiled and told him that work had been keeping me busy. That answer seemed to satisfy him for only a moment. Olivia mentioned that the housing market remained competitive and joked that owning property had become nearly impossible for first-time buyers. My mother looked toward me and said she hoped I had not given up on the idea of owning a home someday. I thanked her for the encouragement without mentioning that I already owned several properties. Years earlier, I might have viewed the conversation as another opportunity to defend myself. Now I simply listened. There was remarkable freedom in allowing people to underestimate you when their opinions no longer controlled your decisions. As lunch ended, my father insisted on paying the bill. While walking toward the parking lot, he placed a hand on my shoulder and told me that families should always support one another. Hearing those words felt strangely bittersweet because they described the relationship I had wanted for most of my life rather than the one we had actually shared. I drove away wondering whether something had genuinely changed or whether I was simply seeing a temporary version of the people I had always known. The answer came sooner than I expected. The following Monday evening, my father called again. This time he sounded slightly hesitant. He explained that business at the repair shop had slowed over the previous year. Rising costs, new competition, and unexpected expenses had made things difficult. He did not ask me for money, but he spoke at length about financial pressure in a way he never had before. He mentioned that he and my mother had been discussing different options for the future and wanted to become closer as a family. I listened carefully, offering sympathy without making assumptions. Before ending the conversation, he asked if I would be available later that week because there might be some paperwork they wanted me to look over with them. The request immediately reminded me of my own appointment with Daniel Brooks. I explained that I already had a meeting scheduled with an attorney on Thursday afternoon, but could meet another day if necessary. There was a brief silence before my father asked for the attorney's name. When I told him it was Daniel Brooks, he sounded genuinely surprised. He laughed softly and said that was an incredible coincidence because he and my mother also had business with the same attorney that afternoon regarding some estate planning documents they wanted to update. We agreed to meet there afterward if our appointments finished around the same time. After ending the call, I sat quietly at my kitchen table, thinking about the strange series of events. The timing felt almost too perfect, yet I dismissed the feeling as coincidence. I organized the folders containing my deeds, insurance records, mortgage statements, and identification before placing everything neatly into a leather portfolio. Early Thursday afternoon, I drove toward Daniel Brooks's office beneath bright blue skies, expecting nothing more than another routine legal appointment. I had no idea that within the next hour, a single document resting inside that portfolio would quietly reveal the truth about my life in a way that years of explanations never had, and the expressions on my parents' faces would tell me more than words ever could. Daniel Brooks's office occupied the second floor of a quiet brick building overlooking a small public square. The waiting room was warm, comfortably furnished, and filled with the faint scent of fresh coffee. A receptionist greeted me by name, accepted my portfolio, and asked me to take a seat while Daniel finished another appointment. I glanced at my watch and realized I had arrived almost 15 minutes early. For the first time that week, everything around me slowed down. People walked past the large front windows carrying shopping bags and cups of coffee, completely unaware that an ordinary Thursday afternoon was about to become one of the most unforgettable moments of my life. A few minutes later, the front door opened, and my parents stepped inside. My mother noticed me first. She smiled with genuine surprise and waved as though we had accidentally run into each other at the grocery store. My father walked over and shook my hand. He seemed relaxed, almost cheerful. Olivia followed closely behind them, carrying a folder tucked beneath one arm. We exchanged polite conversation while waiting for the receptionist to finish organizing paperwork. My father joked that attorneys always seem to enjoy making people wait. I laughed politely, and for a brief moment it truly felt like an ordinary family gathering. Then Daniel Brooks appeared in the hallway. He greeted each of us warmly before explaining that my appointment would only take a few minutes because most of the documents had already been prepared. He invited me into his office while my parents remained in the waiting area for their own meeting. Daniel closed the door, motioned toward a chair, and opened the leather portfolio I had brought with me. We carefully reviewed every document together. He confirmed ownership information for each property, verified beneficiary designations, discussed liability protection, and recommended several updates that would simplify future estate planning. His calm professionalism made the process straightforward. One by one, I signed the necessary forms while he organized certified copies into separate folders. Finally, he reached for the largest document in the stack. It was the updated deed for the 3-unit brick building I had recently purchased. He reviewed the legal description aloud before placing the final page in front of me. Across the top appeared the official ownership information in bold print, followed by my full legal name, Ethan Michael Carter. I signed where indicated, and Daniel congratulated me on building an impressive portfolio at my age. He commented that very few people developed such a disciplined approach to long-term ownership so early in life. I thanked him, feeling slightly embarrassed by the compliment. Before I could gather my papers, someone knocked gently on the office door. The receptionist stepped inside and apologized for interrupting. She explained that my parents had arrived early for their appointment and that Daniel had accidentally placed one of my folders with the documents prepared for the following meeting. Daniel smiled, picked up the folder containing the certified deed, and walked with me into the reception area so he could correct the mistake before continuing with my parents. Everything happened so naturally that nobody realized the significance of the moment until Daniel opened the folder. He glanced down at the first page, immediately recognized the error, and said, almost absent-mindedly, that this file belonged to Mr. Ethan Carter rather than the Carter family estate documents. As he turned the folder toward himself, the top page remained visible for only a second or two. That was all it took. My father looked directly at the heading. His eyes moved from the property description to the ownership line and then stopped completely. My mother leaned slightly closer, following his gaze. Olivia also glanced down. None of them spoke. They simply stared at the words printed across the page. Owner, Ethan Michael Carter. Daniel apologized for the mix-up without realizing anything unusual had happened. He handed the folder back to me, and I thanked him before placing it carefully inside my portfolio. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. My father blinked twice as though he believed he had misunderstood what he had seen. Finally, he cleared his throat and asked, in a voice far quieter than I had ever heard from him, whether that document belonged to me. I nodded calmly. There was no satisfaction in my answer, only honesty. He hesitated before asking another question. He wanted to know whether I actually owned the building described in the deed. I answered yes. Then my mother asked whether it was an investment property. Again, I answered yes. Olivia looked at me with open disbelief and quietly asked how long I had been buying real estate. I smiled gently and told her it had been several years. Nobody responded immediately. Their expressions changed from confusion to surprise and finally to thoughtful silence. It was not the dramatic confrontation I might have imagined years earlier. There were no raised voices, no accusations, and no speeches. The simple truth resting on a single sheet of paper carried more weight than any argument ever could. For years they had built an image of my life using assumptions instead of questions. In less than a minute, that image quietly disappeared. Daniel invited my parents into his office for their appointment. still unaware that anything remarkable had taken place. As they slowly followed him down the hallway, my father looked back at me once before disappearing through the doorway. It was not a look of anger or disappointment. It was the expression of a man realizing that the story he had repeated for nearly 2 decades had never actually been true. And for the first time in my life, I did not feel the need to explain myself because the evidence had already spoken for me. When my parents finally stepped out of Daniel Brooks's office nearly an hour later, the atmosphere had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. My father no longer carried the confident posture that had followed him for most of my life. My mother held her folder tightly against her chest, and Olivia looked from me to them as though she was trying to understand how an entire family story had shifted in a single afternoon. Daniel shook everyone's hand, wished us a pleasant day, and disappeared back into his office, leaving the 4 of us standing together in the quiet reception area. My father was the first to speak. He asked if I had time to get a cup of coffee before heading home. His voice was careful, almost uncertain. Years earlier, I might have expected another lecture or another attempt to explain why my choices were somehow inadequate. Instead, I simply nodded and agreed. We walked to a small cafe across the street, ordered our drinks, and found a table near the window. For several moments, nobody spoke. Finally, my father looked at me and admitted that he had not known anything about the properties. I smiled gently and told him that was true. He asked why I had never mentioned them. I answered honestly. I said that every time I had tried to talk about my goals when I was younger, the conversation usually ended before it really began. After enough years, I stopped feeling the need to convince anyone that my plans mattered. It was easier to let my work speak for itself. My mother lowered her eyes toward her coffee cup. She quietly admitted that she had assumed I was still renting because I never corrected them during family gatherings. I explained that I had considered it many times, but eventually I realized that success did not become more meaningful simply because other people believed in it. Sometimes protecting your peace meant allowing misunderstandings to remain exactly as they were. Olivia leaned forward and asked how many properties I actually owned. I hesitated for only a second before answering truthfully. I explained that I owned the duplex, the single-family rental, and the 3-unit brick building, all managed carefully with long-term planning rather than quick profits. She stared at me with genuine surprise before laughing softly. She admitted that she had spent years selling homes while never imagining that her own brother had quietly become one of the investors she often described to clients. There was no jealousy in her voice, only disbelief mixed with admiration. My father remained silent for a long time. Then he looked directly at me and said something I had never expected to hear. He admitted that he had underestimated me. He confessed that after watching me leave home with very little money, he assumed I would always struggle because I never talked about chasing promotions, flashy careers, or expensive lifestyles. He believed that ambition had to be loud in order to be real. I listened without interrupting. There was a time when those words would have felt like a victory. Instead, they simply sounded like honesty arriving many years late. I told him that I understood why he thought that way because I had once believed success needed to be visible too. But life had taught me something different. The strongest foundations were almost always hidden underground. Nobody admired them because nobody could see them, yet everything above depended on their strength. Financial security worked the same way. Most of the important work happened quietly, one careful decision after another. My mother reached across the table and gently placed her hand over mine. She apologized for every time she had compared me to someone else or assumed that my quieter path meant I lacked direction. She admitted that she had confused silence with failure. I squeezed her hand gently and told her that holding on to old disappointments would not improve any of our futures. The past could explain people, but it did not have to define them forever. My father then asked a question that surprised me even more than his apology. He wanted to know whether I would be willing to teach him some of the things I had learned about real estate investing. His repair shop was still operating, but he admitted that he had begun thinking about retirement and wanted to understand different ways of building financial stability. Years earlier, I might have felt tempted to remind him of every prediction he had made about my future. Instead, I remembered all the evenings Harold had patiently answered my questions without making me feel embarrassed for asking them. Real wisdom was never about proving someone wrong. It was about helping them see something they had not understood before. I smiled and told my father that I would be happy to share whatever experience I had gained, as long as he understood that there were no shortcuts. It had taken years of discipline, patience, and quiet consistency to build the life I now enjoyed. He nodded with complete sincerity. As we finished our coffee and stepped back outside into the warm afternoon sunlight, I realized that the greatest change had not been the expression on my parents' faces when they saw my name on the deed. The greatest change was inside me. For the first time in my life, I felt no need to seek approval, no desire to win an argument, and no satisfaction in being proven right. The document had already said everything that needed to be said. What remained was not revenge, but the quiet freedom that comes from knowing your life has finally become your own. Several months passed after that afternoon at the attorney's office, and life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and completely new. From the outside, very little had changed. I still woke before sunrise, still visited my properties every week, still answered tenant calls personally whenever possible, and still believed that steady progress mattered more than dramatic success. The difference was not found in my schedule. It was found in the conversations that slowly began reshaping my family. My father started calling every few weeks, not to question my decisions, but to ask thoughtful questions about budgeting, maintenance costs, financing, and long-term planning. For the first time in my life, he listened more. Then he spoke. Sometimes we spent an entire Saturday morning walking through one of my rental properties while I explained why I preferred durable materials over expensive finishes or why choosing reliable tenants mattered more than collecting the highest possible rent. He never interrupted with criticism. Instead, he paid attention in a way I had quietly hoped for years ago. My mother changed in quieter ways. She no longer compared me to Olivia during family dinners or asked whether I had finally found a better opportunity. Instead, she asked how my latest renovation was progressing or whether my tenants were happy. The questions were simple, but they carried something I had not recognized before. Respect. It was never forced or exaggerated. It simply grew naturally once assumptions disappeared. Olivia also surprised me. As a real estate agent, she began referring potential investment opportunities that did not match the needs of her traditional home buyers. Whenever she discovered an older property with strong long-term potential, she would send me the listing along with a short message asking what I thought. Sometimes I purchased the property. Sometimes I passed because the numbers did not make sense. Either way, our conversations became genuine exchanges of ideas rather than silent competition. Looking back, I realized that honesty had quietly replaced comparison throughout our family. One evening, nearly a year after the meeting with Daniel Brooks, my parents invited everyone to dinner at their house. The familiar kitchen looked exactly as it always had. The same wooden table stood beneath the window, and the same family photographs decorated the walls. As I sat down, I could not help remembering another evening many years earlier when I had stood in this very room, holding an acceptance letter while my father confidently declared that I would never own anything. That memory no longer carried bitterness. It simply reminded me how much people could change when they were willing to let go of certainty and accept truth instead. After dinner, my father disappeared into the living room for a moment before returning with a small cardboard box. He placed it on the kitchen table and slid it toward me. Inside were old photographs, report cards, and newspaper clippings from my childhood that my parents had carefully saved over the years. Beneath them rested the acceptance letter I had carried into this house all those years ago. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but I recognized it immediately. My father admitted that after I walked out that day, my mother had quietly retrieved the letter from the trash after he threw it away. She had kept it all those years because part of her always believed I deserved the chance to build the future I wanted, even if neither of them had known how to encourage me at the time. My mother smiled through quiet emotion and admitted that she often wished they had listened more carefully instead of deciding who I would become before my life had truly begun. I held the letter for several moments without speaking. Then I folded it carefully and placed it back inside the box. I thanked both of them, not because the past had been perfect, but because we finally understood it honestly. Before leaving that evening, my father walked with me to my truck. He looked at the familiar vehicle, laughed softly, and admitted that he had always assumed I kept driving it because I could not afford anything newer. I laughed with him and explained that the truck still ran well, cost almost nothing to maintain, and reminded me every day where my journey had started. He nodded and smiled before saying that perhaps the most valuable things a person owned were not always the easiest to notice. Driving home beneath the evening sky, I thought about everything that had happened over the past 15 years. The properties, the long workdays, the sacrifices, the quiet victories, and the unexpected reconciliation with my family were all important chapters, but none of them represented the greatest reward. The greatest reward was discovering that confidence did not come from proving doubters wrong. It came from refusing to let their doubts become your own. The deed that carried my name had never truly been about real estate. It represented every early morning, every disciplined decision, every opportunity embraced with patience instead of pride, and every moment I chose progress over resentment. I had spent years believing that owning property would finally prove my worth. In the end, I learned something far more valuable. Houses could be bought and sold. Buildings could be renovated. Investments could rise and fall with the market. But the one thing nobody else could ever own, diminish, or take away was the quiet confidence earned by building a life that reflected your own values instead of someone else's expectations. That was the greatest possession I had ever gained, and unlike any deed filed in a courthouse, it belonged entirely to me.